Good morning, everyone. My name is Satyamurthy Kabilan. I'm the Vice President of Policy at the Public Policy Forum, and thank you very much for attending today. Before we begin, we would like to begin by acknowledging that we are in the Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which the Mi'kmaq and the Wolastoqiyik people first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties did not deal with surrender of lands and resources, but in fact, I'm hoping that wasn't me, but in fact recognized the Mi'kmaq and the Wolastoqiyik title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. Today, I think we're all very familiar with the challenges that our digital world provides. The issue that we have around what happens when we look on the internet for information. Now, why is that so important, particularly in 2019? We'll be facing a federal election in Canada in 2019. We will be facing a provincial election in Alberta. We'll be facing a provincial election in PEI, and there's a territorial election as well. Now, if we get our news, our information, our viewpoints through digital media, and if we use those as a key tool and a key set of insights for how we make decisions at the polling booth, there's a very important discussion we need to have about all of that digital information. Should we believe it? Can we rely on it? Is someone else playing with it? And that's the genesis of a whole series of talks that the Public Policy Forum is running with the support of the Government of Canada on digital democracy. On Monday, we were in Vancouver to talk about the whole issue of the attention economy. Why are companies, technology firms, so interested in your eyeballs and what you're watching online? The second part, which is what we're going to hear from today, is the issue of synthetic media or deep fakes, the ability to create new forms of digital media or to edit or embellish media that we see today. And the third part, which will be running in Montreal, will be around the use of artificial intelligence and how that is shaping what we see and what we perceive in our digital world. All of these topics are part of a broader educational push to help Canadians think about what they see online and hopefully consider how they use that information when it comes to their decisions in the ballot box. So, we will be recording and sharing these events. They will go up on YouTube, they will be sent out through media outlets, and the idea is to get this out to as many people as possible so that we can try and get a better grip on some of these challenges. What we're going to do today is, I'm going to say a few introductory words. We have two moderators who will be joining us. First and foremost, we have Karen Foster, who's Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair in Sustainable Rural Futures for Atlantic Canada. Dr. Foster is a sociologist whose research and writing spans the sociology of work, political economy, and historical sociology. She has drawn on both qualitative and quantitative methods to study economic issues from a sociological perspective. The history of productivity as a statistic and a concept, generational divisions at work, young people's experience on social assistance, and youth out-migration from rural communities. In addition to her scholarly work, she has also written about these topics for the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and the Tyee. So Karen is going to come up and say a few words to introduce the topic, and she's also going to introduce our speaker for today, Carl Miller. Once Carl has spoken, we're going to have a little bit of a fireside chat and a little bit of a discussion about some of the insights that Carl will be sharing with us. And for that, we have Howard Ramos, who's Professor and Associate Dean of Research at the Faculty of Arts and Sciences here at Dalhousie. He's a political sociologist who investigates issues of social justice and equity. He's published on social movements, human rights, indigenous mobilization, environmental advocacy, ethnicity, race, and Atlantic Canada. He's currently working on projects looking at Atlantic Canadian, secondary cities, state funding of NGOs, environmental advocacy, tourism development, and integration of immigrants and refugees. He works with graduate students looking at these issues as well as Indigenous health and understandings of environment, the history of sociology, state funding of women's organizations, environmental advocacy, and public attitudes and social values. So he will be joining us for a fireside chat to discuss some of the points that Carl will have raised during his talk. At the end of that, we're going to open the floor to you. And again, I'm sure you will have questions based on what you hear today. I welcome you to interact with Carl and with Howard in terms of what you might see as some of the challenges, and in terms of what thoughts you might bring as to how Canadians might be able to deal with this challenge going forward. So just to center us on this topic, I'm going to run a short video for you, just to show you what we are talking about when it comes to synthetic media. And hopefully that will come up onto the main screen. The joys of technology that even I can't figure out. So this will give you a little bit of an explanation to what we mean when we talk about synthetic media. This video, it's just 1 minute. It will be available on the Public Policy Forum's YouTube channel as well.
Seeing isn't always believing anymore. New technology can create fake photos and videos that look very, very real. This technology has become a part of everyday life. It's used to create amazing special effects in movies and TV, but it has a dark side. It can be used to show people doing and saying things that they haven't done or said.
We need to be more vigilant with what we trust from the internet.
They're called deep fakes, and they could be coming to an election near you. Because we vote for candidates and political parties based on what they say and do, our choices are especially vulnerable to deep fakes. And if we can't trust what we see, what happens to our democracy? Learning how to spot a deep fake gets us closer to the truth.
I'm sure that isn't the Russians trying to hack into the whole system to keep an eye on Carl and what he's saying today. So that's what we mean when we talk about deepfakes and the challenges that... I promise you that's not me. And so this is the issue of synthetic media and deepfakes, which we are heavily concerned about, and why we've got Carl Miller with us here today. So with that, I'd like to welcome Karen Foster to open up with her opening remarks. Thank you.
Okay, I'm kind of scared to get close to this thing. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming today, and thanks to the Public Policy Forum for doing all of the heavy lifting on this event. We are very fortunate to have Carl Miller with us to talk about the impact of synthetic media, and especially the worrying phenomenon of fakes, fake news, fake videos, and so on society and democracy. Carl is the research director of the Centre for the Analysis of Social Media at Demos, a UK-based educational charity that conducts research and disseminates research in 5 key areas of empowered citizens, power in institutions, inclusive communities, shared prosperity, and social media. His writings have appeared in Wired, The New Scientist, The Telegraph, The Guardian, and The Sunday Times, and a host more. He is a regular on BBC news programs and has appeared on ABC, CNN, and Sky News. He has provided thoughtful and cogent analysis of our online lives, demystifying everything from viral memes to online surveillance, hate speech and hacking, to social media's impact on electoral outcomes. He has pulled back the curtains to reveal that there are people and interests, and in some cases, bots, behind what happens online. He's the author of Death of the Gods, the new global power grab, published in 2018 by Penguin Random House. The book has been called a tour de force by the esteemed sociologist Anthony Giddens. When I saw that, I thought if somebody at Anthony Giddens' level liked what I was doing, I would just pack it in. So thank you for not retiring yet and sharing your work with us. Carl's book explores power in the so-called digital age, and it bumps into something that social scientists have been arguing about globalization and modernity for decades, that our lives are characterized by this paradoxical mix of increasing liberation but also increasing control. But studying this paradox through the case study of the internet reveals that, as Carl put it in a recent interview, power is concentrating and dispersing in different, unprecedented ways. It's empowering people who were previously on the margins of the margins, but it's also entrenching elites. So his findings lead him to conclude that power has, quote unquote, gone wild. In numerous arenas, the norms that societies have used to keep power in check have met their match in new digital technologies. To the extent that power has, as Carl puts it, drifted.
All right, I'm really not going to touch this microphone at all, so I am not to blame if this happens again. Right, so this came up.
We're entering an era in which our enemies
video.
can make it
Look
look like
closely at
anyone
this.
is saying anything at any point in time.
Entering
Even if
an
they would
era
never say
in which
those
our
thi-
enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time, even if they would never say those things. So, for instance, they could have me say things like, I don't know, Killmonger was right, or Ben Carson is in the sunken place, or, how about this, simply, President Trump is a total and complete dipshit.
Probably just about, right? It doesn't quite feel right. Like the kind of musculature's wrong, the kind of the way that Obama looks is slightly wrong. Like this, so this came out kind of maybe 6 months ago now, and kind of washed around the internet in a fury. This was kind of the first time that most people had kind of encountered deepfakes. As kind of Cabby says, this came out of the kind of the CGI world. It came out of the world of movies, and suddenly we began to realise that it was getting easier and easier, cheaper and cheaper to create videos which could portray politicians, it could portray public intellectuals, academics, really anyone that you wanted to say anything that you wanted. And still, just about now, it doesn't quite look right, but it is rushing forwards. Probably within about a year, I mean, variations differ. Within about a year, this will be indistinguishable from a normal person, and it will be cheap, maybe even free to do. So we are moving into the world of deepfakes very, very quickly. Does anyone recognize this person? Well, you can't, because this person's never lived. This person doesn't exist. This person was created by a generative adversarial network. This person has never walked this planet. But I bet you can't really tell the difference between this person and a real one. He's never lived either. She's never lived either. This kitty has never lived either. This kitty is a kind of inhuman kitty that only exists in the imagination of an algorithm.
How can I help you? Hi, I'm calling to book a women's haircut for a client. I'm looking for something on May 3rd. Sure, give me 1 second. Sure, what time are you looking for around? At 12 p.m. We do not have a 12 p.m. available. The closest we have to that is a 1:15. Do you have anything between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m.?
So what's the point here? The point is that we're stepping into a world which is very, very weird and strange. Machines are increasingly able to look like, sound like human beings. Maybe human beings are actually increasingly beginning to behave a bit more like machines at the same time. But as that conversation showed, that was Google's new technology. They're going to use it in virtual assistants to kind of book appointments for you. That was obviously a hair salon. They're engaging with human beings. The person on the other end of that phone had absolutely no idea. That was a trick. That was why they were laughing in the background as Google was revealing this. Had no idea that that was a robot. So I want to tell you all, maybe 15 minutes, I want to tell you a story. I want to tell you a story about how this technology is beginning to be used in ways which have brought all of you, and me, everyone, to a kind of new kind of front line. Because around us, a kind of strange new kind of warfare has begun to happen. It has our opinions in its sights, our attitudes, our ways of seeing the world, the reasons that we get up in the morning, the problems that we see out there, the ways we try and solve those problems, all of which are things that this kind of warfare is concerned with. And it's increasingly having political impacts. So I want to tell you a kind of story, really, about how this warfare emerged, where it's come from, what it looks like, what it does, who's doing it, and actually what it means for democracy, for all of us, and maybe the Canadian elections as well. So a strange new form of warfare, one with a strange origin, because this warfare began with cats on the internet. Cats are the origin of all of this. So we'll jump back to 2003. We'll jump back to the birth of 4chan. Now increasingly notorious as a home of the alt-right and the pro-Trump communities online. 4chan initially began just an image board, began a kind of bubbling cauldron of online subcultures. Plenty of people didn't feel like they fitted into offline life, and they took to places like 4chan as a place where they felt they actually fitted in. And they began to create their own subcultures, their own norms, their own languages, their own ways of seeing the world as a result. And 4chan grew unbelievably quickly. From thousands of posts to millions to billions of posts, 4chan became this kind of seething center for how culture was changing on the internet. And then, kind of later on, as the internet spread further and further, people on 4chan, and I was kind of there actually at this time, they noticed with horror that the normies had followed them onto their internet. They had gone onto the internet to escape, and now mainstream life was going onto their internet as well. Companies were increasing on the internet. Banks were allowing you to bank on the internet. Governments were being concerned with the internet. And there was a kind of deliberate discussion that began to take place. They began to say, okay, if the world is invading our internet, and they really did believe it to be their internet, well, we are going to use the internet to invade their world. That was roughly the line of thinking. And so kind of 4chan began to kind of gather together this kind of strange mix of different literatures and understandings. They looked at some things that the military had began to write on things like mimetic warfare. They began to look at behavioral psychology and understand how we're really habit-ridden, how we're lazy. We kind of tend to believe the kind of same things again and again. They looked at how ideas spread. They called it ideational diffusion. They looked at why we shared things. And they began to piece together a kind of strategy of sorts, or a series of tactics, to try and use the internet to have influence in the offline world. And they basically did it all for the lulz. This was just incredibly funny, incredibly empowering, I think. I mean, I can't imagine the kind of power that these people began to feel at their fingertips as they began to do these things. So they went on to Oprah Winfrey's forum. And they said they represented themselves as a paedophile network. They said we have over 9,000 penises. Now, this was a 4chan in-joke. For any kind of digital cultural people in the room, this refers to Goku's power level on Dragon Ball Z. Of course, Oprah Winfrey herself didn't take this as a joke at all. And in front of her millions of viewers, she warned them all that they'd been contacted by an enormous paedophile network of 9,000 people that apparently were all raping children. And 4chan went crazy. Nowadays, we would have called this media operations, the use of the internet to put stuff into the mainstream media, to reach far more people than they ever could before. Back then, they just called it the Lulz. They hacked online polls. Justin Bieber did an online poll to work out where he should go on tour. 4chan tried to send him to North Korea. Time magazine did a poll for the kind of top Time person of the year. Not only did 4chan rig it so that Moot, that is Chris Paul, the creator of 4chan, came number one, but they then rigged every single name after that to spell another 4chan indoke, Marble Cake the Game. They did swarm attacks. So they began to realize that they could actually kind of attack a single target from loads of different places all at once. So back then, actually, 4chan was remarkably anti-racist, and the rumors spread across the internet that this game, Habbo Hotel, was racist. So they created kind of guides, and they coordinated, and they all kind of swarmed into this game. They kind of blocked the entrances and exits of the game. They began to create swastikas and to protest, seemingly from all these places at the same time, against the racism they thought that their game was propagating. And they created sock puppet accounts. Sock puppets, fake accounts, not real, administered maybe by one or a few or a handful of people, but it looked like that thousands and thousands of people were getting into the debate. They realized that suddenly we can make things trend. We can make a topic look like it's really popular, and maybe the press will start reporting on it. And that was simply through creating sock puppets, or sometimes they call it astroturfing, loads and loads and loads of fake accounts all at once. And each and every time they had one of these victories, they seemed to manage to change the offline world in an important way. They celebrated it with a deluge of memes. Cat memes, ceiling cat, long cat. Your enterprise has been seized by HackerCat enterprises, you get nothing. And this wasn't an accident. They realized that if you packaged an idea up within a cat, it spread really, really well around the internet. Cats reminded people of babies. And they realized that the reason that people share things isn't because they were made to think something, it was because they were made to feel something. And if you could kind of like pluck those primordial psychological strings, something being really cute, something being really outrageous, then people would share it almost instantly. So they packaged their ideas up as cats. They realized that was an amazing way to spread them around the internet. So all these different things, whether you call it mimetics, whether you call it media operations, swarm attacks, they wouldn't have used any of those words. They might have called it attention hacking, but really they just called it the Lulz. But that, of course, isn't where this story ends. Other people cannot stay out of the question of influence for long. And the next thing that happened was that all the tactics, all the tricks, all the things that 4chan were doing became commercialized. They got turned into a series of services and products. So it took me roughly 5 minutes on the darknet to find the huge mega bot pack. This is a series of scripts which allows me to essentially set up and run social media accounts on every single social media platform you can think of. I can set up and run Amazon accounts. I can rig auctions on eBay. Of course, I can set up Twitter accounts and those on Facebook. I can do them on VKontakte. I can do them on Sina Weibo, every single Chinese social media account. And this costs $3 to do. So it begins to kind of lower the barriers to entry. You don't need to script anymore. You don't need to be able to code. You just download this thing and away you go. Then large online marketplaces began to emerge. So this is an online marketplace selling fake social media accounts as something like kind of bottles of wine. So on the one end, you've got the kind of cheap plonk, you've got the kind of new stuff, crude stuff, but then you can go all the way up to kind of seasoned, aged, sophisticated, complex vintages. And this is a large, flourishing network. They have special offers. They'll have LinkedIn Day, where you can buy LinkedIn accounts for 25% off. It's in Russian language, actually. I think this is a translation into English. But you can see that pretty much every single social media platform is on there, and it's all a kind of floating marketplace. And then when you have all your fake social media accounts, there was then a series of kind of pieces of software that rose up to allow you to manage them all. So this is a piece of software called Tweet Attacks Pro. which allows you to kind of begin to manipulate your vast zombie army. You can kind of program to do what you want. You can program them to engage with people in a certain way, to retweet certain things, to go out there on Twitter and to respond when certain people make certain kinds of messages. And what this essentially was allowing to happen was all that Lulz, all that kind of fun stuff that 4chan was doing, that all these digitally savvy, very innovative young people, primarily on 4chan, began to work out could actually change the world. This began to turn that into a series of services which were competing with each other on price and functionality. So suddenly it was a marketplace. Suddenly you had lots of different options for how you would do disinformation on demand. And as soon as you have that, you have innovation. You have people that are trying to find kind of new kind of offerings for this community, and it began to grow and grow. Around this time, I would say we're kind of talking 2005, 2006. This is when kind of political parties began to be interested in these kinds of offerings. And it was never obviously, of course, the political parties themselves. It was always the campaign hires a kind of digital manager. That digital manager hires consultants. Those consultants hire kind of spammy online marketers. And those spammy online marketers would have links to this illicit economy. And they would reach into the darknet and they would begin to use these things. And then first in Latin America, then in Europe, we began to see that every single election seemed to begin to use this kind of attention hacking. They would deliberate kind of manipulation of online reputation systems, search engine bombing, where suddenly, you know, if you Googled your rival's name, loads of news stories would come up which are completely false, and of course we all trusted them because Google was telling us that they were real. All these things began to appear in every single election, and will continue to appear in every single election. And at the kind of high end, and we can't just think this is a few Russian bots. We also had the emergence of legend farms. So there's one in Poland. They manage 30,000 fake social media persona. Each one is done entirely manually. Each one has its own IP address. It has its own interests. It has its own linked series of social media accounts. It has its own writing style. It has its own friends and family, which of course are other fake persona online, 30,000 of them. And these are indistinguishable from a normal person online. There is no way that you can look at one of those accounts and immediately tell the difference between that and a real person. So first it was for the lulz. Then it became a kind of disinformation on-demand marketplace. And then last, I think, militaries began to apprehend what this meant for them. And kind of around the world, like a stack of dominoes, kind of militaries all, I think, went through the same basic kind of reasoning. They all went in the kind of end of the Cold War. We now live in an information society. Information is really central to how society operates. How do we need to change as militaries to also do something about this? How do we need to fight wars differently? And then one after the other, they said, okay, in the information age, we need to put information into the heart of warfare. Now, we're going to talk about this in a moment. Information, propaganda, these things have always been parts of the tools of war, but I don't quite think that's what happened here. Somewhere along the way, as militaries went through this, as they kind of rewrote their operational doctrines to focus on behavior, somewhere along the way, they began to conceive of information as a theater of war. Now, let's just pause on that just for a moment, because that is really weird. So, information wasn't something used for warfare. Warfare was something that happened in information. So, air, sea, land, space, and information. And so militaries began to create problem-solving guides, which were kind of laden with these strange new concepts: information dominance, information maneuver. How do we move around in the information space? How do we dominate the information space? How do we do mimetic forms of warfare? The poetic Russian formulation of this was cognitive, moral, informational infiltration. But whether it was a liberal democracy or an autocracy, really every military around the world has essentially gone through that same kind of rethinking of what warfare really is, and where warfare actually takes place. And then over the last, say, 3 or 4 years, kind of researchers have begun to see what this actually looks like in practice. And around the world, we've seen time and time again that it's not only spammy marketers, it's not only political groups online like 4chan, but it's actually state militaries that have begun to actually do many of these same techniques. Many of the same techniques that 4chan was doing: swarm attacks, trolling, pursuing journalists, creating synthetic media. Synthetic, of course, not only in the content, but also in how it appears to you online, where it comes in the search engine results, how popular it seems to be, and whether there are millions of other people that are reacting to it or not. We think now, roughly, there are 48 different countries which have shown clear signs of information warfare happening. It's often done angled actually at the population itself, especially in autocracies. So in China, there are 2 million people that are writing hundreds of millions of posts a year to try and kind of change the subject when it gets primarily when it gets too political on Chinese social media platforms. You've got Penya bots in Mexico. You've got automated accounts in Saudi Arabia that are lionizing the regime there. Of course, we've seen both in Brexit in the UK and the election of Trump in the States, and I'm sure it's going to be happening in the Canadian elections as well. We've seen the interaction not just of one, but of several militaries, not just of Russia, but also Iran, and plenty of others. So in country after country, event after the event, sometimes in ways which look really weird, militaries have become involved. Now, a lot of this wasn't actually simply trying to replace one opinion with another. So it wasn't just to make you love a certain kind of candidate. It wasn't just to make you vote in a particular way. Quite often, as we're kind of going through the data and trying to understand kind of what is actually happening, we see that a military has actually created groups on both sides of the debate. So the Kremlin created social media-based anti-Putin protest groups, believe it or not. They were active both in Blue Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter. In the UK, they created groups on both sides of the Brexit debate. So the kind of emerging idea is that this isn't about trying to make people think something differently. It goes all the way back to 4chan. It's trying to make people feel something differently. It's to find the kind of wedge issues, the pre-existing social tensions which exist in every society, and trying to use them to drive society apart, to try and undermine the basic trust that people have in institutions, in their democracy, in their media, in their politicians, to actually kind of, in the broad, grand scheme of things, create this kind of general attritional feeling in many of us that everything's gone a bit rotten, that we can't really trust what we see online from anyone, and that our democracy isn't working properly, that our politicians are lying to us even more perhaps than they are anyway, and that we believe them to be anyway, and that the institutions which surround us are becoming less and less effective. So all of this strange new form of warfare, I think, means several things. Firstly, it's cheap and technically trivial for militaries to do, and there's no cost in them doing this. Compared to buying a fighter plane or an aircraft carrier, this is really, really easy. This is really, really cheap. And at the moment, there's no cost to militaries to doing this. There's no definition under any military treaty. There's no deterrence. It's not even illegal. Secondly, it's a strange new kind of conflict, which, although it's brought us to the front line, has been one that I don't think a single military around the world has actually found a defense for. No government knows how to defend their own media ecologies from this yet. Quite often, the solution of fighting information warfare is more information warfare. So it's kind of like, it's actually kind of spearheading like the increased and more rapid militarization of the internet even more. We don't know how we can kind of de-escalate. The people that are actually in the front lines of the defense here are the tech giants. And the tech giants, when they have the money to do so, have built teams which are constantly defending their platforms from this kind of thing. They know this is an arms race. They know that they are constantly having to build new defenses to protect against new forms of attack. And I think that is actually causing the internet to begin to kind of splinter a little bit between the parts of the internet that have a business model behind them and the parts of the internet that don't. So if you're Facebook or you're Twitter, or to an extent if you're Reddit, you're going to be able to afford the very expensive developers and artificial intelligence experts that you need to fight this new kind of warfare. But if you're Wikipedia, if you're web forums, if you're Quora, if you're the parts of the internet that we actually use quite a lot and rely on for truth as well as social media platforms, you don't. And those are the areas that I think are especially vulnerable to this. So, yeah, as was said in the introduction, this is the book. As in the introduction, this was one of the areas, and I think one of the most worrying areas, where I think power has gone wild. So we've always tried to cage power. We've always tried to limit the way in which I can use power to reach and affect your life, and you can use power to reach and affect mine. We've always tried to say there are certain ways that can be done and certain ways that cannot be done. And the kind of rules and laws and norms and professional standards have always formed these bars around power. They've always tried to cage it. And at least in this case, as in so many others, whether it's in politics or crime or the media, power seems to have slipped out from those bars. War, in its normal form, is actually an incredibly rules-bound activity. We know when it's declared, we know when it ends, and broadly speaking, sides in the war tend to follow a series of rules. And this new kind of warfare, if it is warfare, is dancing around the definitions that we have. Is it war? Is it struggle? It doesn't use violence, but it seems to be done by militaries to achieve the things they've always wanted from using war. We don't know. What's a military officer? What's a civilian? What's real? What isn't? What's automated? What isn't? What's a NGO? Can we really trust what we see online? Those are all now things which I think it's kind of actually flourishing in because it's able to kind of transgress all the definitions that we have. So I'll end on a final worry, and it's this. Whether or not this kind of warfare is effective, and to be perfectly honest with you, we don't know whether this is throwing elections. We don't know what effects it's having. We know that trust is going down. We know conspiracy theories are going up. We know that people are vaccinating their kids less. We know that people are turning away from mainstream media. That's probably happening for reasons that are beyond information warfare. Information warfare might be making them worse. We know society is becoming more polarized. But we don't really know the individual effects of this. But the danger also is that when we believe that information warfare is everywhere, when deep fakes go everywhere, we're just simply not going to trust the information that we encounter online. We're going to call everyone a Russian bot. We're going to call every single video a deep fake. We're going to call every portrait of a person algorithmically generated. And that is kind of not only demolishing to our trust in the people that we encounter online, it actually completely erodes the enormous, unbelievable kind of democratic potential of the internet. You know, a thing that, and this is so sad, a thing that kind of we've always thought is going to completely transform the way in which democracy works for the better. That it can kind of be this entirely new way that maybe we even make decisions on a democracy, but certainly the way in which we relate to politicians, we understand arguments, we follow elections. And in many ways, the kind of growth of information warfare is, I think, standing on the cusp of kind of undermining the potential of the internet to actually make democracy stronger, because we're going to think it's everywhere. So that's the danger. Power's gone wild in this case, as it has in so many others. And we now, as in so many other areas, need to begin to learn how we catch up all the squishy human stuff with the technology. How do we make laws again? How do we make laws faster? How do we make rules? How do we make norms? How do we increase public scrutiny? How do we keep public awareness kind of following and flowing with information warfare as quickly as all of these tools and tactics are changing? Thanks very much.
Hello? I had to brace myself in case we got the white noise. Well, thank you very much, Carl, and thank you everyone for coming this morning for what's, I think, a very important topic, and hopefully I can help facilitate moving the discussion that Carl brought into a broader discussion that will open up to the room as well. So to begin the discussion, I can't help but ask, plus ça change, plus ça reste la même. As you were mentioning, it's not the first time in human history that we've heard of militaries thinking about the role of intelligence. You can look to Lulz in The Art of War. You can think of Francis Bacon, knowledge is power. So this is something that's constant in recorded human history. We can even think of old-fashioned fakes, old-fashioned deep fakes, the Trojan horse. What makes this different, and what can we learn from how societies have adapted in the past to these very issues?
It's a great, oh God. That is very loud now. It's a brilliant question. So you're right. Like, militaries have always tried to control information. They've always tried to control narratives. I think that the internet, however, opens up a brand new kind of lie. So now it's within the capability of militaries and actually plenty of other people. So the barriers to entry into this kind of warfare are incredibly low, and there's so many other groups that are doing the same things. It opens them up to not just, say, plant media stories or propagate a particular narrative. It also allows them to create the entire crowd as well. And I think that is genuinely new. So we know, like, psychologists have known for a long time that human beings we love mimicry. Like, we become convinced and we change our behavior on the basis of what we're seeing around us. It's difficult and kind of mentally costly for people to kind of stand out from the crowd, and they kind of are quite selective about the things that they tend to do that with. Now, like, through the kind of widespread subversion of online platforms and the internet, you can feel like you're surrounded by millions of people that are all reacting in a certain way which is in fact false. And I think that regardless of the kind of strength of the evidence, regardless of the arguments, that will cause people to begin to shape and twist and change their behavior in order to fit in with the crowds that they see online. And I don't think that is the same as what we've seen before. I genuinely think that is quite new and very powerful. And that is exactly what we actually see militaries do. They don't just try and create a message and spread it. They create entire kind of online kind of systems to create groups. They create kind of almost like these weird digital front organizations, which then real people join, and it becomes like almost indistinguishable from a real group. And that is the creation of culture and social links and identity. That's not just a message arriving in your inbox, that you can choose to believe or not. That is actually the kind of like getting to the very basics of kind of how we form ourselves as human beings. And I think the kind of internet is offering like an unbelievably potent opportunity for kind of coordinated, organized groups to get involved in that in ways that I just simply don't see in the past they've been able to.
Well, I definitely agree that the internet offers a new set of opportunities. And if you look at kind of more recent changes in terms of technology that have stemmed from the internet, you can look to social media. And what's interesting about social media, within 5 years of Twitter's emergence, a number of regimes throughout the Middle East and North Africa collapsed. But it wasn't militaries that provoked the change. It was actually people on the ground. So this kind of leads me to kind of question, what does this mean for states? And this is something you engage with in your book, The Death of the Gods. Is it really the militaries and the states that we should worry about, or is it the kind of rogue small groups that now are able to create the appearance of legitimacy and power, which they wouldn't have been able to do before, and that it's states that will react maybe a little too late to these changes?
So when we go back to kind of 2011, 2012, the kind of Arab Spring, Tahrir Square, we saw the kind of Middle East like begin to throw off the yoke of a series of very long-standing, decades-old dictatorships, including Mubarak, the kind of like the longest-serving dictator in the world at that point. Like kind of researchers and writers like me foolishly supposed that social media was making authoritarian states impossible. How can there be another Mubarak, we thought, when you have Facebook and Twitter, and people can so easily coordinate themselves online in ways that states struggle to control. Now we're living through what's called the techlash. So over the last several years, I think, like writers and researchers and academics have like realized actually that supposition was totally wrong, and that actually open networks can be easily exploited by authoritarian regimes. So in many ways, I think that indeed, yes, I mean, there was an undermining of state power back in 2012. And I think that what we're seeing now is in many ways a kind of state responding to that. Like states are changing what they think warfare is because they've realized that there's been this whole world which has kind of been rumbling under their radar for very long that has enormous power for political mobilization and opposition and protest. So the wheels of states rumble slowly. They're never the first thing to do anything. But states also have a great potential to reform themselves, to reorganize as society changes around them. And when those wheels start to roll, they roll very decisively. So quite often, there is this kind of ancillary question to this, which is, okay, so we've got kind of political campaigns that are doing this, we've got online groups, like what's so different from states doing it? But I think the game really does change when you have the kind of full kind of technical power of a state, and the budgets that a military has beginning to try and systematically work out how the internet can be used for influence. That is a very different prospect from even a political campaign, but certainly from 4chan.
Well, certainly states are reacting, and you can see, in Europe, new data policies that have come online, the right to be forgotten. In Canada, as we move into the election cycle that we're dealing with, there's new laws about political advertising, and Google has decided to opt out. So we've talked a little bit about groups on the ground. We've talked about states. What's the role of corporations? The biggest holders of information right now on the internet are actually Alphabet Group, Apple, Amazon, and Microsoft. What role do they play in terms of challenging states and democracy and offering us an internet where we can have democracy?
Yeah, so they are on the new front line of this. They're the people building the defensive measures. It's a whole kind of offensive-defensive struggle which is happening in the shadows. We see nothing of what's happening. Their platforms are constantly changing. All the time they're implementing new mitigation to try and get over this. But I think the kind of problem is more profound than that. So I think they actually begin to need to add something which they've actually existed throughout their entire life to take away, and that is friction. They've made things really, really easy to do. They've made messages very easy to share. They've made joining their platforms just a couple of clicks. They've judiciously taken away friction from behaviors that they want us to do. How easy is it to join Facebook? How easy is it to leave Facebook? Anyone try to leave Facebook? Oh my God, you have to do so many. I mean, sometimes in order to leave these platforms, you actually need to physically write to them in a letter. This is a kind of friction that they try. But the things that they've wanted to remove friction from are actually the things which militaries also really benefit from there being no friction in. So very easily setting up an account means that, yes, of course, normal people are going to do it, and more of them because it's easy. But of course, that means that can be gamed and synthetically done. So in a way, I think we're going to have to move out of a frictionless world, a world where information can be spread in a second, and they're going to have to judiciously reapply friction to things, make it more difficult to set accounts up, make it more difficult to share stuff. And that's a responsibility for all of us as well, I think, is to kind of begin to just try and slow down a bit. Don't share things immediately because they make you feel something. A very important aspect of all of this, and this isn't just warfare. This is viral advertisers. This is the whole world of advertising. Really, is kind of like the use of our psychology in a way against us. Like if you read any book, read Hooked by Nir Eyal. It's a book about how to make social media platforms as addictive as possible. Now, all of these books, and it's written quite cheerfully, and oh yes, let's make this addictive so that more people use it. It's addressed to entrepreneurs. I was shocked, actually, when I read that book. But it's industry standard. And all of these different books, as a whole literature, all of them are essentially using this kind of grab bag of psychology, behavioral psychology, habit formation, dopamine studies. They're really, really carefully looking at exactly why we do the behaviors that we do and how, therefore, on the basis of that, they can change behaviors in ways which they want.
I'm beginning to think it's easier to leave the mafia than to leave Facebook, based on what you're saying.
Pretty much. I mean, you have to do so many clicks, and it's friction. It's friction management. I mean, another word for this is choice architecture. And I think we just have to begin to learn that the choices which are made easiest for us to do are not necessarily the choices that are actually good for us in both an individual and a collective sense.
As we're talking about what we can do, I'd like to transition to one last question and then open up to the audience. But I think it's an important question in the Canadian context as we're in an election cycle for a federal election, and as was mentioned in the region, we have other provincial elections. How can you see fake media, synthetic media, affecting the election, and what should we do as citizens, or what can we do as citizens to be fully engaged to protect our democracy?
So if the strategy is consistent here with where we've seen it happen elsewhere in Western democracies, it will be to find wedge issues, and it will be to use those wedge issues to drive polarization and undermine trust in political institutions. So you'll see scandals possibly emerge that are genuine and real. You know, but the way in which society reacts will feel more polarized, it will feel more febrile, conventions will begin to be pulled down, politeness will begin to be removed. I think political debate will feel rawer, and it will feel more mimetic. And so it's kind of social cohesion that in many ways will be the target. It's kind of to use the election as a general way of kind of undermining a sense that everyone is together, that everyone shares a society, and that has a kind of common set of values. Now, of course, Canadian society in general is less vulnerable to this, far less vulnerable to this than America, for lots of very, very good reasons. But I think that will be what the large target will be. Now, in terms of what we can all do, I've probably got two suggestions. One is a kind of general mindset. So I think we have to begin to kind of come to terms with the fact. I almost want to suggest don't learn about politics from the internet. But I'm not quite there yet. But if this continues, I think that will be what I begin to say. But not quite there yet. But firstly, if you do want to kind of learn genuinely about the world from the internet, the kind of mindset that we need is that the information which is trying to find us is not the information that we actually need to find. So the huge messages that are going viral, the memes, the things that are really carefully packaged up, the things that make us feel something immediate, they're not the bits of information typically that will actually make us learn about the world. So kind of proactive rather than reactive kind of learning. Go out and kind of go to the sources that you trust and learn about the world from them. So that's a kind of general mindset. And then, of course, and this is a kind of longer term thing, there's a series of skills that we need. We called this in 2012 in my think tank. We call this digital fluency. And it was a kind of combination of critical thinking skills that we've always needed. You know, the ability to kind of triangulate sources, to weigh up evidence, to know the difference between good and bad evidence, to kind of be quite skeptical of the things that you learn. The things that we've always needed, really, and the internet hasn't changed the need for critical thinking. But also with this kind of other skill set, which is to know how lies can be told online. And that's what I was really trying to kind of like give you all some kind of exposure to today. To know that search engine optimization can be done in a way which is really illicit. To know that there are kind of copywriting services where you can really, on an online order form on the internet, kind of pay someone to write kind of it makes it look like 35 different crude-looking newspapers have all broken a story, which you can then brief a newspaper on, and maybe they'll run it online as well. To know that Wikipedia might be vulnerable too, and there's no single site that I think can be fully trusted. So this kind of digital fluency aspect, which also means kind of breaking out of the kind of bubbles that we sometimes find ourselves on online, and going and seeking a diversity of different sources and stories from different areas. Now, the difficulty is it's really easy to say, and it's really hard to do. So I go around saying, oh yeah, you need to kind of like learn about the world from different sources, you need to triangulate it. And do I always do that online? Of course I don't. Because it's difficult and time expensive and costly. It's hard to learn about, it's hard to look past memes and virals and learn about the world from other sources. So it's a really difficult ask, but kind of, the kind of making kind of political engagement just feel less convenient and easy and fast and frictionless, is probably important to actually make it actually stronger and less prone to manipulation and more likely to actually buttress and support democracy and make it stronger.
Great. Just make our life more difficult and we will have democracy.
Yeah, in a weird way, that's what we need to do.
This being said, facetiousness aside, I want to make sure that we have some time for some questions from the audience as well. And it's great, we already have a question. I don't know if we have a microphone for the audience or how this... Sorry, okay, we have some online folks as well. So if you just give a second, it's just like Oprah. Michelle's come in with the microphone.
We've already had across the country in a provincial setting a candidate for premier saying, we won't do this, whatever the this is, we'll play by certain rules. But it sort of begs the question, what is the person hiding? Or is it a genuine request that we play traditionally without these new iterations that are confusing to us all? And I can well imagine that it'll appear, it's already appeared, but it will become more accelerated as we get into September, October on a national federal level. Microphone to next person.
Do you have any reactions?
Well, I mean, I think it's a good point, and of course the temptation is actually to kind of step away from all of this entirely. Now, I would love for there to be a political system where everyone can kind of just agree not to use the kind of potent new arsenal of campaigning tools which exist online. But if Canada manages to do that, I think it will be a wonderful exception, because quite aside from these manipulation tactics, ever since the first Obama election, every single campaign in the world has understood that digital politics is a key route to power. I mean, Obama raised more money online than he did offline. He set up thousands of events. He raised more volunteers online than he did from any other platform. I mean, this is it's the most kind of rapidly changing and high yield part of campaigning now. And I don't think that politicians can afford to stay off. Like, simply when they're contemplating their own kind of likelihood of being elected. I think that around the world, time and time again, sometimes grumbling, sometimes grumpy, often not really understanding what they're doing, but every single candidate has dragged themselves online. They know they need to be on there, they know they need to win on it, they know it's the way they can reach constituents, raise money, and galvanise volunteers.
Money does seem to be a double-edged sword. Could be legitimate, could be non-goodwill.
Yeah, so the comment there was that money could be a double-edged sword, and I completely agree, absolutely right.
We have a bit of a queue developing, so the next question's
Wonderful.
here.
You put out a great analysis of the problem, and can you hear me? Throw out a challenge to individuals. I'm wondering what you'd like to see from corporations and perhaps more importantly governments to try and deal with this.
So yes, let me focus on governments. It's a kind of strange. Governments have been largely absent from any of the defensive side of this. So the reaction has typically been that liberal democracies have kind of built their own information warfare apparatus to do it, but there's been very little innovation or thinking about how you actually defend your own systems from it. Largely, I think, because it just is really, really difficult to do that. What I would love from governments is for this to actually begin to be kind of seen as a form of warfare which just simply you need to increase the cost and difficulty of adversary states doing. So, do you see any making a start? No, not yet. It needs to be defined in international treaty. There needs to be deterrence architectures against it, and there needs to be costs. So, typically speaking, like governments and mutual defence pacts around the world, like levy costs against kind of violent kind of attempts to disrupt their own states. They say at the very least, we're going to identify the people that are actually responsible for this, and we're going to make it illegal for them to do this, and we're going to levy penalties on them. This thing isn't even illegal to do. It's not breaking any laws. I mean, it's a crazy environment where you could have a state or concerted numbers of individuals deliberately, systematically trying to throw an election in a way which is entirely legal. So the first thing that needs to happen is that governments need to actually step in, legislate, define, and then work out what of their levers, be it multilateral treaties or be it domestic law, that they can do to reach out and begin to make this kind of just simply more expensive and difficult and riskier for people to do.
How likely is that?
I think it's likely. I just think it's going to take 10 years.
Although at the same time, isn't that also limiting democracy?
Yeah, and this is like why part of the thinking from autocratic states, especially Russia, but it was others as well, when they began to kind of go down this path and try and build information warfare, was a realization that they were never going to kind of conventionally outmatch the West militarily. So they decided to kind of change what war was. And this new kind of war is actually inherently much more difficult for liberal democracies to fight within than it is for autocracies. Because autocratic states don't have free and open media to be exploited, there aren't any elections to be thrown, and there are no laws preventing militaries kind of mucking around in a free and open press. And of course, very rightly, like we all, like liberal democracies, UK or Canada, we have laws preventing militaries from doing systematic press manipulation. Like, because it's a bad thing to do, and we know that that's injurious to democracy as well. So yes, it is. I mean, it's another double-edged sword. It's another kind of paradox where, in a way, like our laws that constrict our militaries from mucking around information are there to protect democracy. It means that our militaries cannot do anything, which means there are no defensive apparatus in place, which is also damaging democracy.
We have another question from the floor from Karen Foster.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about states and citizens, or states and society. And at the beginning of your presentation, when you were running us through the beginning of 4chan and how eventually kind of the tactics turned into things that could be sold on markets. So that got me thinking about like political economy and concepts like accumulation by dispossession, where something that is once free becomes marketized. So I'm wondering if you can say more about where capital fits in here, like who's making money, and is that as relevant as the states and their goals?
So that's a really good question. There's kind of smoke and mirrors that exist online, especially the dark net, makes it very, very difficult for us to know who is who. We don't really know where the money is coming from. It's often flowing around in the form of cryptocurrencies, which are very hard for us to track. If these dark markets are similar to others, for instance, ones where zero-day exploits are bought and sold, or where state secrets are bought and sold, and they exist out there as well, or drugs, you have a very weird world where states often try and behave like criminals, and criminals often try and portray themselves as states. And they all kind of get involved in this market together and often buy and sell from each other. So to give you just another kind of weird example of this in the flesh, once a year, every year, this very odd conference happens called DEF CON. It happens in Las Vegas. Suddenly a whole new player comes into town. They're all wearing kind of black. They all have like, you know, mohawks and blockchain tattoos and kind of born to hunt written across their t-shirts or things like that. And as they arrive, the bus network literally crashes as they walk down the strip. The casinos wheel in their ATM machines and stop taking cards. And that is because tens of thousands of the world's best hackers all descend on Las Vegas at once. And when you're there, like you don't know who is who. It's kind of like a physical version of the darknet. You don't know who's intelligence, but there's certainly intelligence there. You don't know who's a criminal. They're certainly there as well. You don't know who's a kind of interested, kind of mild-mannered researcher like me. You know, and there are people like us and journalists there too. And the weirdest thing of all of that is that it doesn't matter. Like they all learn from each other, they all kind of hang out with each other, they all get drunk with each other and swap the kind of like the tips and the hacks of the year. And that's kind of what's happening online, this kind of strange kind of smorgasbord of different identities and groups and individuals and interests kind of all mixed up under this kind of cloak of anonymity. Because just like DEF CON, where you don't give your name, they don't care who you are, you hand over your dollars and you're into the conference, just that is the darknet. No identities, no idea. So it's likely that the disinformation on-demand marketplace is a mixture. It's likely that part of it is organised crime. Part of it are just single individuals that kind of sell the kind of like infrastructure to do this kind of stuff. So I might be a hacker. I might, say, compromise computers in order to whitelist IPs. So basically, like it's likely that there are some people in this room that have computers that have been compromised by hackers to basically mean that when you're asleep, your computer is probably doing some of these things. Maybe it's controlling some of these automated accounts. Maybe it's doing a kind of like being part of a hack. you're useful because you don't obviously look like a Russian intelligence agent. So when Facebook is trying to limit like who's able to set accounts up online, they're not really kind of downtown residential Halifax isn't on their radar. So hackers will use that. So it's likely that there are criminal elements, and it's likely that there are states too, all buying and selling from each other.
We have another question right here in the front.
I missed the first part of the event, but I was wondering if they talked about was discussion about something called deep fakes, where it's like they can put a person's face onto another person and make it look like they're doing things that they're not doing. Have you spoken about that?
Yes, we did. Yeah, it began with deep fakes as kind of an example, I think, of how I think a broader trend, which is simply that computers are getting better at being like human beings. It's not just deep fakes, and it's not just the kind of creation of synthetic images. There's also a whole incredibly exciting, bubbling field called natural language processing. I use this a lot in my research myself. Now, natural language processing essentially is the science and art of teaching a computer to understand what you're saying. Natural language. So you saw that dialogue, we showed a dialogue of kind of this Google bot speaking to a receptionist in a hair salon. Now, what was really happening there, the reason that was so amazing, was that Google has got so good at doing natural language processing that essentially a kind of automated persona can pretty much understand the vast variety of things that could have been said to it and come up with a response. It's an engineering marvel. Every year, the world's kind of big natural language processing conference doubles in size. Every single one of the tech giants is probably doing more NLP than it is almost anything else. We're very, very close to passing the Turing test. So this will be a kind of an open conversation between a robot and a human being. And it's all part of this, I think, more general trend, deepfakes included, which is about robots understanding us better at the same time as us actually understanding them far less.
Okay, we're running short on time. Oh, one more question from Daryl Dexter. I always find that when you say that you're running out of time, you get 2 more questions.
That's right. So one of the things that always frustrates me in this discussion is, and you hear it all the time, which is that when we talk about electoral politics, we say, well, we don't really know if these are affecting political outcomes. But we really do know, don't we? I mean, we see polarization, the shaping of opinion, all of these things. We may not be able to measure it exactly with respect to a specific campaign, but we know they're affecting campaigns. If you destroy institutions, if you pull down the level of discourse, there's I think a very good argument that Trump's victory in the United States was simply because in the end he seemed like the lesser of 2 evils. Everybody had been so undermined, even though he was so outrageous. People kind of said, well, he's not as bad as the alternative. So we do know they're affecting electoral politics, don't we?
Well, what's difficult is that they're kind of hijacking like deeper social processes which existed before they ever came along. So American politics started to be polarized really around Clinton, slightly before that. And in general, like democracy's been in trouble long before social media came along. I mean, Demos was set up in 1993 because in order to get people re-engaged in politics, because even then, which looks like a panacea of trust and political engagement compared to today, even then there was all these worrying signs. Electoral turnout was falling with every single generation that entered the electoral register. Trust in politicians was already like rock bottom. It was already lower than estate agents in the UK at that point, back in '93. I don't know if estate agents are highly trusted professionals here in Canada, but in the UK they don't have a huge amount of trust. The kind of average age of a political party member in the UK was in the 60s, back in '93. So it seemed like there was a kind of generation after generation of people that increasingly just didn't think that democracy was working for them. And so what's difficult is that people that are arguing against the impacts of this can kind of point back to a series of pre-existing social trends and say, maybe there's no difference whatsoever. Maybe, you know, I mean, maybe the trajectories would have been the same without any of this. Likewise, I think there is a danger in believing that everything is coming from disinformation online. So, I mean, I personally think that Trump was elected as the result of a series of profound social and political trends that were happening in the States. And I think it can be quite kind of comforting for me to tell myself that Trump was elected because the election was hacked. But I think that's kind of too easy a kind of explanation. But certainly, I think inarguable is that this kind of activity is exacerbating and making worse a series of social trends that are themselves quite damaging to democracy. I think that's inarguable. And there are areas where we really can see the kind of physical offline kind of results. So, for instance, one of the things that information warfare officers love is conspiracy theories. Really, really easy way of making people distrust their government are conspiracy theories. Now, conspiracy theories have rocketed over the last kind of 5 or 6 years, and we are now seeing the direct offline impacts of that. So, anti-vax conspiracy theories, probably my real bugbear, is actually now producing kind of measurable declines in the people that are vaccinating their children year on year. So yeah, but it's just very difficult during elections to kind of tease out all the different effects. I mean, the kind of the dark secret that many kind of people that work in campaigns will say is that they don't really know what works and what doesn't, because people are being collided with by information coming from all different kinds of interventions, all different parts of the campaign, all at the same time, and it's just really hard to know. And I don't think people themselves know what really kind of made the change, what really kind of influenced them. So yeah, I agree with you. I think we can definitely say this is having an impact, but it's really hard to disentangle what was already existing from what's happening now.
Okay, I think we are going to be a little short on time if we take too many more questions, but I think we can have one more follow-up here. Yeah.
This is only an observation. Brexit, it's coming. It'll probably be delayed. It's of great interest to us here in Canada. Might we have your views or observations, however incorrect or imprecise, for the final solution action result? Adios.
The result of Brexit? Yeah. Oh my God. It's a nice easy question to end it on. There's never been a moment like this in my kind of political lifetime. I work for a political think tank based in Westminster, and everyone is now a bystander and a spectator to this kind of grotesque parliamentary dance that seems to be happening. To be honest with you, I have absolutely, literally no idea how this thing is going to end. On behalf of the UK, I'm sorry that we did it. I think it's one of the kind of greatest kind of most damaging decisions that a country has inflicted upon itself. And the other kind of great kind of sorrow with this is that it's taken up so much parliamentary time that nothing else can be done. So when we're talking about kind of regulating the social media platforms or creating law to say what you can and can't say online, or how do we respond to information warfare, all these new problems that the internet has thrown up that we actually desperately need to have as part of the political process, there is zero bandwidth and zero time for politicians to do anything, and zero capacity for the civil service to do anything other than basically try and handle Brexit, which they're not really, they're struggling to do even that, to be perfectly honest with you. So, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't really know how it's going to end up. We'll leave. What that leaving looks like, I think, is still massively up in the air. Apart from seeing some of the most beautiful things I've ever seen in Canada recently, the other great thing of me being out here is that I kind of get to stay away from Brexit for a few days. But yeah, I just really don't know. I'd just like to take a kind of final kind of opportunity to just say thank you, everyone, so much for coming. When you're an author like me and you're kind of sat alone in a room, kind of slogging away at the book, there is always this kind of like fear in the back of your head, like, will anyone ever read this? Will anyone ever listen to what I have to say? That is genuinely a fear, and it always sits on your shoulder. So it means a lot that you all came, because it's really, really nice to kind of finally be able to talk about some of these ideas and discuss them with you. So thank you very much.
So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much, first of all, to the various partners who've helped make this happen. Dalhousie University for hosting us today. Global Public Affairs have been a part of this and will be helping us with developing some of the media that go around this. The Government of Canada, of course, has provided some of the funding for us to be able to bring Carl over and to be able to run this. And, of course, to all of you, to Carl, to Howard, to Karen, thank you very much for being here to listen to this. And my hope is that you'll be able to take a couple of things back. And I'd like to leave you with two thoughts which Carl has put to us. I think the first one is, when we're dealing with synthetic media is designed to evoke an emotional response. So what Carl said to you earlier, when that piece of information comes in, you go, damn it, I really need to share this. That's when you need to go, stop, think, and look at it again. I think that's the first thing we need to do if we're thinking about dealing with the issue of synthetic media, is don't let the emotion get a hold of you. Stop and think. The second thing which Carl brought up, which was really useful, is the way synthetic media spreads. It is the information that's trying to find you is not necessarily the information you want to find. And I think that's the other piece when we think about synthetic media. It's designed to find you, but maybe that's not what you want to find. And I think on those two notes, very, very useful pieces of advice in terms of how we deal with our digital world and the challenge of synthetic media. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much. Keep an eye out for the videos that will come out on the back of this. And hopefully you'll be able to share this. You'll be able to help educate your fellow Canadians. This is not about putting one viewpoint over the others. It's just about asking people to think carefully before you register something as being the truth or the way of the world when you see it on the internet or on a digital platform. Thank you very much.